Hey everyone, GameCube with Fries here with another new collection video. Sort of getting to the tail end of my classic game collection. Going to be looking at my Sega Genesis collection today. Out of all of the more classic game systems I own from the 8-bit or 16-bit era, the Genesis is probably the system I have the most games for. It's mostly because of affordability. I used to be really huge into Genesis collecting. Not as much now, but I'll still occasionally pick up a game or two. There's still a lot left that I want to play on the system. So, starting off, Afterburner 2, which is a port of an arcade game that was done by Sega. I believe it was designed by Yu Suzuki. He would go on to do other games like Virtua Fighter and Shenmue, which is my personal favorite Sega game. This is really fun. It kind of keeps looping through these different stages. It's more of a sort of test of endurance, I guess, to see how far you can get. It gets pretty challenging. It's really fun. It actually plays really well, despite how disorienting the game actually looks. But yeah, I definitely recommend this if you're a fan of the sort of old school Sega arcade games. Aladdin. This game is ridiculously fucking hard, just like all of the other Disney games developed by Virgin Interactive that I've played. This this game is rough. It's rough going. It controls well, and it actually has this very smooth animation. But to this day, I can't get that far. It's an extremely challenging game. Altered Beast. The label's kind of worn out. This was a pack-in game for the Genesis back when it first came out. And people are pretty mixed about this. It seems a lot of people really enjoyed it, or some people don't like it because of how simplistic it is. You're just basically moving right, punching shit. And that is true, but it is fun to some degree, especially if you play it cooperatively. And the different transformations, it's kind of fun figuring out, how they work, what moves you should use against the boss, because usually the way it goes is the stage boss, certain moves might be completely useless, but then one will be really effective. It's just really fun figuring out how to go about using all these different powers. Atomic Runner, which is another kind of auto-scrolling arcade game. You play as this guy who basically... It's kind of a run and gun, but not really. The controls are very strange. You're constantly moving to the right, and you can't move left. Pushing left just stops you in place and lets the screen scroll ahead a little bit, and it'll sort of push you along. You'd sort of jump and bounce off of things. You fire in a bunch of different directions. It's kind of confusing when you first start playing it, but it's actually a lot of fun if you get into it. It's very challenging, though, especially with the very bizarre control scheme. Battletoads Double Dragon, which is essentially a sequel to Battletoads, which is, at least in my opinion, not a very good game. But this game's fun. It's kind of a side-scrolling beat-em-up, but it plays a little bit differently than a lot of other beat-em-ups from the time. The controls feel a lot lighter and floatier. It's not as much of a slog to play through this one. Enemies don't take 50 hits to kill. You don't have to, memorize different combos or anything. It really relies more on your ability to dodge and memorize level layouts. There are a lot of stage hazards. It never gets ridiculous to the point where the first Battletoads did. That game was completely hard to a fault. But this one's actually pretty entertaining. I actually really enjoy this game. I believe it was also out on the NES and the Super NES, if I'm not mistaken. Ernest Evans. This is another very bizarre game. It's like a side-scrolling action platformer, but the character, instead of being a single sprite, it's a bunch of like limbs that are segmented together, and it has the character just moves in a very awkward kind of robotic way. And you know, your main attack is a whip, and you kind of flail it around, and the hit detection is very bizarre. This is definitely not a good game, but I absolutely love it. I have no idea why. It's just such a strange game. I've always been fascinated with it. It's really cheap too, so if you're looking for a really weird, fun game, then definitely look for a copy of that. Genesis 6-pack, which is a compilation of games. It includes the first Sonic the Hedgehog, the first Golden Axe, the first Streets of Rage, Revenge of Shinobi, Columns, and Super Hang-On. These are all very, very, very good Genesis games. I think this... I actually don't know how much this goes for nowadays. Probably not that much. Genesis games generally don't climb much in price. I definitely recommend picking this up over all of those other games individually, unless you like really need to own the individual copies. But I would say if you're looking to not blow a bunch of money, then check this out, because this has a lot of really good Genesis games on it. Columns in particular, one of the few puzzle games I can really sort of dig into. And here I have a standalone copy of Golden Axe. The only reason I had this is because it came with a bunch of other Genesis games. I got it at a garage sale a very long time ago. But this is one of my favorite games on the Genesis. It's kind of a fantasy beat-em-up, but at the same time, again, it feels a lot lighter and springier than other beat-em-ups from the time. It's actually very, very short. You can beat this in like maybe 20 minutes. It's really it's fun to play cooperatively, but at the same time, it has the same problem a lot of other Sega games like this do, where you can hurt your ally. So, you know, if you're gonna play it with a friend, make sure you keep an eye on where you're going. And Golden Axe 2, which not quite as good as Golden Axe 1, but it's still really good. It's a bit more difficult. It's a bit longer. I don't know. It feels like it sort of starts recycling enemies a little too soon, and the levels aren't drawn out. They're still very brief. It just feels, the whole thing feels a bit more beat 'em up-ish than the first one. It feels a little more drawn out, a little more overly difficult. Excuse me. But it doesn't reach the point of tedium that Golden Axe 3 does. That game is garbage. Golden Axe 2 is alright. Another Disney game, The Lion King. This game is fucking impossible. To this day, I still can't get past the second level. This is a very hard game. I don't know how much I can recommend it. I don't really care for it that much. And Might and Magic, Gates to Another World. This is a game I've been meaning to get into, because it's kind of an open-ended RPG. It's a port of an RPG that originally released on computers, I believe. And there's just a ton of different shit you can do. It's very open-ended and very complex for the time, and I haven't set aside enough time to really sit down and dig into it, but one of these days I very much plan on doing so. It definitely seems right up my alley in terms of what I enjoy in an RPG. Speaking of RPGs, we have Phantasy Star 2, which I believe was one of the first, if not the first, major RPG on the Genesis. It's a sequel to the first Phantasy Star, which is a Master System game. And this game is pretty good. Again, I haven't managed to set enough time aside to really dig into it. It does seem a bit grindy, which is kind of a problem that a lot of games, a lot of RPGs from this time period have. But it is pretty cool. For the time, it was definitely unique. A lot of other RPGs out at the time were more fantasy-based, like the Dragon Quest series or Final Fantasy, whereas this one took more of a sci-fi approach, which is something they stuck with through the rest of the series, I believe, except for 3. 3, I think, was a bit of a fantasy game. I haven't really played it that much. But yeah, this is definitely a pretty neat game. I just need to actually get into it. I have a bad habit of buying RPGs and then never getting into them. I gotta break that habit. Rambo 3, which is a very good top-down action shooter. It's not just straight up running around blowing people away with different power-ups. It actually does feel a bit more slower paced. You just have the one machine gun, and then you can switch between a bunch of special weapons like your knife. You have bombs. I believe you have a bow and arrow. And it's a lot of fun. It is a bit challenging, but it's not the hardest game out there. It's pretty short from what I understand. I haven't finished it, but at the same time, it's been a very long time since I played it. So if you can find this for a couple dollars, I actually really recommend it. I've never even watched the Rambo movies, but I think this game is really good. Rocket Knight Adventures, one of the few major games that Konami actually released on the Genesis. This is a really fun, unique platformer where you jump around and hang off of branches with your tail, but your main attack is like a sword, but you also have this rocket pack that you can charge up, and you can do this charge attack, which also serves as a form of attack and getting over obstacles, bouncing off of walls to reach higher places. It's just very creative, and again, it's pretty challenging, but it's just that right level of challenge that you see in a lot of other Konami games at the time, like something like Super Castlevania 4 or Gradius 3. It's hard, but it's not ridiculous. It's fun. You're definitely not gonna just sit down and beat it on your first go, but it never gets to the point where you just want to throw down your controller and quit. This is really good. It's also pretty cheap, I think. There were a couple sequels, one on Genesis and one on Super Nintendo. I haven't picked those up yet. I think they've gotten a little expensive. I don't remember. Sonic the Hedgehog 2. This is one of my favorite Sonic games, but at the same time, I believe they fixed it when they ported it over to different compilations. The initial release is a little bit on the buggy side. I've gotten stuck in infinite loops before where I've gotten stuck between two springs and couldn't get out. But overall, I really enjoy this game. The level design just flows a lot better than Sonic 1. Sonic 1 honestly feels a bit on the wonky side to me. The movement feels better. I think the introduction of the spin dash really kind of moves things along. It gives the game a much better flow. That's what I would say. And the level design just feels a little better, even if the initial game is a bit on the buggy side. Got people driving motorcycles all up and down the street. Sonic 3. And I don't know, I get the feeling that this is kind of an overlooked game in the series. Like, a lot of people talk about Sonic 1 and Sonic 2, and, even Sonic CD, that one gets talked about a lot. But I never really hear a whole lot about this one, and it's actually really good. It's really short, but the levels are well designed. Mostly. I do have some gripes with it. I do believe that, because this locks on with Sonic and Knuckles, and I do believe Sonic and Knuckles is the better game. But this one is still enjoyable. It doesn't feel that drawn out. Like they didn't try to just make a bigger game. But, it's alright, I would say it's an okay game. Worth picking up if you enjoy the other Sonic games. Here we have Sonic and Knuckles, which is basically the second half of Sonic 3. I believe they were initially going to be one game, but they had to split it up because of the amount of memory the cartridge would have required would have been too expensive to produce or something. So they put this out. And this alone is a great game. This is probably one of the better Sonic games. This is I might say this is better than Sonic 2. And the thing is, the cartridge flips open at the top. My hand's kind of falling asleep here. And you can, like, you would, like, put Sonic 3 inside, and it would be one game like they originally intended. But unfortunately that feature doesn't work that great nowadays. But this is still definitely worth picking up. One of the best Sonic games, I think. Sonic Spinball? Yeah. Shows you what I think of that one. Spider-Man, which is kind of like a... It's kind of a platformer, kind of, sort of. It's kind of a strange game. You go through these levels, and I was never able to get into this one. There's just something really weird about it. Like, the game felt off. It's not a bad game by any means, but I don't know. There's also a time limit. Like, you have to beat the game within a certain amount of time. It's very strange. I don't know why I was never able to get into it, but, you know, it's kind of your typical 2D action game. Sword of Vermilion, an RPG, which I believe was also another game designed by Yu Suzuki. And this is a really interesting one because it changes gameplay styles almost constantly. Like, the towns will have your sort of traditional top-down RPG view, but then the overworld is completely first-person, like a dungeon crawler. But then, like, same thing goes for the dungeons, but then the combat is set up like a side-scrolling beat-em-up hack-and-slash. And then the bosses are like something like Altered Beast, where it's just side-scrolling, but you're on a single plane. You can, like, block and slash with your sword or use magic. And, or at least I think you can block. I don't know. I've only ever fought one boss, and it was a while ago. But it's just there's a lot of variety here. The only downside is that there's no change in scenery or anything, and the enemies are just constant reskins. But it's really interesting to play. Not the best RPG by any means, but it's kind of interesting to see how many gameplay styles they tried to fit into one game. Really neat stuff. Tasmania, side-scrolling platformer, which this one's pretty good. It's a bit hard to control at times because your primary attack is spinning, and it's very easy to lose control over where you're going, and there's a lot of hazards that you can just kind of blunder into. So you can kind of, like, accidentally go veering off to your death, or, you know, fall down half the level and have to redo a platforming segment. But not a bad game, just a bit rough around the edges. Fun to play, though. Thunder Force 2. The label on my copy is absolutely beat to hell. This is a... It switches between top-down and side-scrolling. It's sort of an arcade shooter, and it's a really fun one, too. Like, each stage is broken up into two segments. The first segment usually involves going around a top-down segment and seeking out these generators that you have to destroy. It has this open-ended kind of feel to it, although it gets confusing because the levels sort of loop infinitely once you pass beyond the edge. So in some of the bigger ones, it can be kind of a pain trying to find each one. And then the second half is your traditional side-scrolling shooter, and it actually gets really hard really fast. Like, right out of the gate, you're just getting bombarded from every direction, and the first boss is, like, it just charges at you. It's a very hard game, but it's also a lot of fun. It's actually probably one of my favorite arcade shooters, just because it mixes things up a little bit by switching the gameplay style every other level. It's really neat. It's also very affordable. I think I only paid like $4 for it. This is kind of a lesser-known gem on the Genesis, Tin Head. It's a side-scrolling platformer where you go around these different levels and you shoot little balls of metal out of your head, and you can switch directions. Like, you can shoot them up or down, or you can have them do kind of this neutral bounce to sort of cover a wider area, or maybe attack enemies that are directly in front of you. But it gets pretty hard. It's a really good game, though. I have to kind of hurry up. My battery is dying. But yeah, long story short, Tinhead is fantastic. And so, really quick before my battery dies on me, these are the two 32X games I own. Knuckles Chaotix and Virtual Racing Deluxe. Knuckles Chaotix is probably my favorite Sonic game of all time. The level design and gameplay mechanics feel a lot more thoughtful than any of the other Sonic games, and although the bosses are kind of wonky, like I'll be fighting a boss and I'm like, oh, I beat it, how'd that happen? It's a bit weird, but it's at the same time it's a lot of fun to play. I really like how it randomizes what stages you go to next. And then Virtual Racing Deluxe is just a really fun racing game, like surprisingly fun, because I really don't go for racing games that much outside of like maybe Mario Kart. But Virtual Racing Deluxe impressed me just because it's a lot of fun to play, it's easy to control. Yeah, it's not expensive either. I wouldn't have paid, I wouldn't have paid more than $5 for it. But yeah, that was my Genesis collection. That about wraps up, I think, all of my classic games, except for maybe the PS1. And I have got to go because my battery's about to die. So I hope you enjoyed. I will see you next time.